Ilhan Omar stood before 300 million Americans on live television and labeled the sitting president an architect of death, completely unaware that her orchestrated ambush would soon trigger the most systematic dismantling of a political career in modern broadcast history. During that State of the Union address, she aimed her finger, delivered her scripted accusations of deceit and fatal offenses, and promptly exited the chamber alongside Rashida Tlaib, who wore an anti-enforcement pin like a badge of political defiance. A mere fortnight later, Donald Trump issued a public challenge, daring her to repeat those exact accusations to his face under the glaring lights of live television, devoid of teleprompters, absent of whispering aids, and with zero opportunities to simply walk away. Believing she was stepping into a career-defining triumph, she accepted the invitation. She was entirely correct about the stakes, but catastrophically wrong about who would emerge victorious. You will want to engage with that like button because the confrontation that unfolded stands as a masterclass in receipt-driven political demolition. She arrived armed with rehearsed rhetoric. He arrived holding a single manila folder, and only one of them would remain standing when the cameras stopped rolling. The setting was a Fox News town hall in New York. Two podiums stood 12 feet apart, facing 400 filled seats, while 47 million viewers watched the broadcast in real time. Arriving first in a dark blazer, Omar arranged her notes within a leather portfolio, displaying surgical precision. 4 minutes before the broadcast commenced, Trump walked onto the stage. He carried no extensive binders or legal pads, just one manila folder and a black marker clipped to his breast pocket. 30 pages and a felt-tip pen were his only weapons. For the initial 11 minutes, the floor belonged to Omar. She unloaded a barrage of standard talking points, labeling him a tyrannical figure, referencing the 34 legal counts in New York, the January 6th uprising, the travel restrictions, and immigration detention facilities. Her finale culminated with a pointed finger aimed squarely at his chest, declaring him the most dangerous individual in the nation, and insisting history would remember him as a tyrant hell-bent on destroying the republic's foundations. As the upper gallery erupted in supportive cheers, online commentators immediately began typing declarations of her victory. Throughout this barrage, Trump remained perfectly still. With both hands resting on the podium and his head tilted, he observed her with the quiet patience of a structural engineer watching a home inspector completely overlook a shattered foundation. Once the applause finally faded into silence, he unclipped the marker, inscribed something onto the folder, briefly displayed it toward the cameras, and set it down. He calmly stated that her performance was sufficient, noting he had been waiting for this precise moment since her televised outburst inside the Capitol. Tapping the folder, he bypassed her gaze and stared directly into the center lens. He explained that a massive binder was unnecessary when undeniable facts fit neatly into 30 standard pages. Pulling a solitary sheet from his folder, he utilized the marker to write a figure across the top $2,900,000. He held the document toward the camera, the fresh ink still catching the studio lights. That specific sum represented the exact amount her campaign had funneled to E Street Group, a company owned by her partner, Tim Minett, during a period when he was still legally married to another woman. Placing the paper face up on the podium like a seasoned card player revealing a winning hand, Trump narrated the details of Beth Minett's divorce filing. Under penalty of perjury, the wife testified that her husband confessed his romantic involvement with the Congresswoman. Trump let the silence hang, allowing the audience to fully absorb the gravity of court-sworn testimony contradicting Omar's public claims of a happy marriage to her previous spouse. He summarized the sequence for clarity. Campaign funds flowed to the partner's firm. The partner confessed his affair to his wife, yet the Congresswoman continued feeding a fabricated narrative of marital stability to the press. When Omar leaned into her microphone to defensively interject that the Federal Election Commission had investigated and dismissed the matter, Trump's hand rose. It was not a defensive gesture, but rather the authoritative motion of a traffic officer halting a vehicle. He immediately corrected the record, pointing out that the commission lacked the required quorum of commissioners to even conduct a vote. The agency was literally paralyzed, meaning the case was never dismissed on its merits. It simply could not be processed. The distinction between exoneration and bureaucratic paralysis is monumental. Moving precisely to his next exhibit, he revealed a page detailing expenses from July of 2020. In a single month, her campaign disbursed $66,000, and an astonishing 77% of those funds were routed directly to her partner's enterprise. He broke down the mathematics for the average voter when a working-class supporter in Minneapolis donated $20, $15.40 landed straight in her romantic partner's pocket. Uncapping his marker again, he wrote the percentage beneath the initial figure. But the documentation grew even more damning. Reaching deeper into his evidence file, he produced a summary of internal billing invoices secured by federal investigators from a cooperating former employee of E Street Group. Even the people processing the paperwork recognized the ethical rot. These specific invoices billed the political campaign for consulting services on the exact dates when travel records confirmed Omar and Minette were vacationing together at a Caribbean hotel, a California resort, and a weekend getaway in New York. Locking eyes with Omar, Trump delivered the ultimate indictment of her financial ethics. He stated that her grassroots donors believed they were funding political advertisements, yet their hard-earned money was actually subsidizing her romantic getaways. He bluntly defined the behavior not as consulting, but as financial misappropriation, disguised by a superior filing system. Her hands visibly gripped the edges of her podium, knuckles turning white under the pressure, while behind her, a staff member's phone illuminated and quickly went dark. The dynamic shifted as Trump's voice lightened into the amused tone he often utilized right before delivering a crushing punchline. He introduced the topic of her husband's businesses, specifically a California winery and a venture capital firm named Rose Lake Capital. At the conclusion of 2023, their combined reported valuation was a mere $700. He noted that such a figure represents the revenue of a weekend yard sale, not a functioning corporate entity. He boldly wrote $700 on the paper. Yet, a mere 12 months later, her official congressional financial disclosure listed those exact same companies with a skyrocketing valuation, reaching up to $30 million. He wrote $30 million next to the original figure. An organic leap from $700 to $30 million in a single year defies all known economic principles. He drew a connective arrow between the two numbers, joking that elite illusionists like David Copperfield or Penn and Teller would be forced into retirement upon witnessing magic of that caliber. The climax of this financial disappearing act occurred when reporters and oversight investigators began demanding evidence. In response to the mounting pressure, she quietly filed an amended disclosure, changing the valuation to zero. He wrote a large zero on the paper, tracing the trajectory of $30 million vanishing into thin air. It stands as perhaps the most brazen statistical evaporation in congressional history. Furthermore, she had previously gone on the record with Business Insider in February, explicitly denying millionaire status and categorizing inquiries into her wealth as right-wing disinformation. Yet her own legal paperwork claimed $30 million before abruptly claiming nothing. Staring unblinkingly into the camera lens, Trump reminded the audience that she had painted him as a fraudster. He countered by pointing out that he constructs tangible skyscrapers with massive gold lettering, whereas she constructs $30 million illusions that evaporate the exact second a financial auditor asks for receipts. Turning his focus back to his opponent, he demanded to know the origin and destination of that phantom wealth. As an individual who has endured more tax audits than anyone in history, he asserted his ability to account for every single cent, challenging her to do the same. Omar's response sounded tightly rehearsed and strained. She blamed the valuation discrepancies on her husband's accountants, framing it as a simple administrative error that was voluntarily corrected. Trump slowly nodded, simulating the posture of a man pretending to entertain an excuse he had already intellectually demolished. He countered that an accounting error totaling $30 million transcends mere administrative oversight. It strictly falls into the category of either profound incompetence or outright financial deception. He reminded her that the disclosure was signed under penalty of perjury, sliding the paper to the podium's edge for the studio audience to clearly view. He summarized the math: nearly $3 million funneled to the partner, $30 million conjured from thin air, and then instantly erased. He expressed utter disbelief that she possessed the audacity to brand him a criminal, shaking his head at the impossible fiction of her defense. Closing the first section of his folder and opening the second, the atmospheric pressure in the room noticeably intensified. The amused, theatrical demeanor vanished, replaced by the hardened expression of a political survivor who had endured multiple indictments, 2 impeachments, and over $100 million in legal expenditures without ever surrendering the stage. He firmly established his status as the most scrutinized public figure globally, listing the endless investigations into his taxes, family enterprises, phone records, and 14 years of continuous deals. Raising a solitary finger for emphasis, he delivered the kill shot. He noted that despite all his scrutiny, he had never once legally married his own brother. The lower seating gallery, packed with his supporters, erupted into chaos, while the upper sections maintained a rigid, uncomfortable silence. Omar's eyes narrowed to slits as her legal counsel leaned forward in anticipation. Dropping his vocal register to convey serious deliberation, Trump clarified that he was neither a judge nor a prosecutor, but rather a man intimately familiar with false accusations, which granted him the unique ability to recognize what genuine innocence looks like. True innocence, he declared, eagerly releases its records, producing a single-page timeline structured with handwritten dates and connecting arrows. He walked the nation through her marital labyrinth. In 2002, she entered a faith-based marriage with Ahmed Hirsi, producing 2 children. By 2009, while still bound by her religious union, she legally married a different individual, a British citizen named Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi. Pausing to tap the timeline, he documented her separation from Elmi in 2011. A year later, she gave birth to her 3rd child, fathered not by her legal husband, Elmi, but by Hirsi. He checked to ensure the audience was keeping up with the convoluted timeline. Moving to 2014 and 2015, he revealed she filed joint federal tax returns with Hirsi, despite Elmi being her legal spouse. Joint filing with anyone other than a legal spouse is a direct violation of federal tax statutes, a fact entirely separate from partisan opinion. Furthermore, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board fined her $3,500 for related violations, cementing the infractions into the undisputed public record. Setting the timeline down, he outlined the final maneuvers. In 2017, 6 years post-separation, she finally divorced Elmi, legally married Hirsi, then divorced Hirsi to marry Minot, the protagonist of the campaign finance scandal. 3 overlapping husbands, improper tax filings, and an 8-year mystery culminated in the pivotal question: was Ahmed Elmi actually her biological brother? The tension in the upper gallery was palpable. A senatorial aide exhaled loudly enough to be captured by the microphones. Trump exercised calculated restraint, admitting he possessed neither the birth certificate nor the genetic testing to prove the familial link conclusively. However, he possessed something equally damning. He produced official documentation from North Dakota State University. When Ahmed Elmi completed his emergency contact paperwork, he listed Ilhan Omar. Under the relationship category, in his own handwriting, he explicitly designated her as his sister. Holding the university form toward a secondary camera, Trump further dismantled her plausible deniability. He mapped out their shared collegiate timeline, their overlapping residencies, and the undeniable fact that Elmi, Omar, and Hersey were all registered at the exact same Minneapolis apartment address. Staring at Omar with the unyielding directness forged across 4 decades of Manhattan real estate warfare, he issued a live, televised ultimatum. He offered her the opportunity to authorize the Department of Homeland Security to publicly release her immigration files immediately. If the records vindicated her, he promised to broadcast his apologies across every major network and social media platform with the same volume he uses for his rallies. A tense, truncated laugh rippled through the studio, but Omar remained stone-faced. He warned that if she chose to hide behind accusations of racial bias instead of providing empirical proof, the American public would permanently solidify their own conclusions. As a leader who has complied with countless subpoenas and audits, he characterized himself as the most open historical text in political memory, whereas she refused to answer a singular question regarding her foundational paperwork for nearly a decade. He reminded her that the Somali immigrants residing in her own district, individuals who legally navigated the grueling bureaucracy and followed every regulation, were demanding these exact same answers. It was never a matter of racial targeting. It was strictly an issue of documentation, which she steadfastly refused to provide. Her voice sliced through the tension, rising in pitch as she regurgitated her standard defense, claiming the narrative was a racially motivated smear that had been thoroughly debunked. Trump's index finger tapped the podium twice in a rhythmic correction, systematically distinguishing between debunking and denying. Debunking requires the presentation of structural evidence that dismantles an accusation. Denying is merely saying no while actively hiding the proof. He stated she had spent 8 consecutive years denying the claims without ever producing a single shred of debunking evidence. Closing the second tab, he transitioned to a newspaper clipping featuring a headline about Amy Bach, who recently received a 41-year federal prison sentence. Bach was the architect behind the Feeding Our Future financial deception, recognized as the most devastating pandemic-era theft in American history. Trump emphasized that $9 billion and potentially more had been siphoned from federal initiatives expressly designed to feed starving children within Omar's own district. He highlighted the brutal reality that this theft was not orchestrated by unknown entities, but rather by individuals deeply embedded within her own community and political infrastructure. Replacing the clipping with a summary from a bipartisan state legislative committee's 84-page report published just 3 weeks prior, he read their damning conclusions. The investigative body determined that her specific legislative contribution, the Meals Act, actively stripped the protective guardrails from the federal nutrition program. She had successfully inserted these loopholes into the 2020 pandemic response legislation, permitting for-profit restaurants to access the funds and allowing unverified meal pickups. She constructed the doorway, and the financial criminals walked right through it. He stared her down, noting that when the committee invited her to testify and requested her internal records, she vanished, relying on partisan allies to block the subsequent subpoenas. When she attempted to interrupt, arguing that his administration had signed the overarching $2 trillion legislation into law, he swiftly crushed the deflection. He pointed out that inside a massive legislative package passed during a global crisis, her specific provision was deliberately buried hundreds of pages deep. She authored the loopholes, her political network understood how to exploit them, and they executed the theft perfectly. Reaching back into his folder, He withdrew a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper, holding it with a delicate reverence, completely absent from his handling of her financial disclosures. It was a plea from Fatima, a legally immigrated Somali-American mother residing in Omar's district. Her children were enrolled in a legitimate nutrition program that collapsed when the funding was stolen. Because political insiders looted $9 billion, legitimate children went hungry, yet the Congresswoman had the audacity to label the federal investigation as mere confusion and chaos. Reading directly from the mother's letter, Trump amplified the voice of a woman who followed all the rules, only to watch her community's supposed protector shield the very criminals who starved her children. Setting the letter down, his jaw tightened visibly. The theatrical performer vanished entirely, revealing a statesman consumed by genuine, righteous fury over $9 billion stolen from the nation's most vulnerable. Without pausing for the audience to recover, he seamlessly pivoted to a new atrocity, a rhetorical tactic he mastered at rallies to maintain relentless offensive pressure. He referenced her infamous remarks at a 2019 banquet, where she summarized the trauma of September 11th as simply some people did something. 2,977 innocent Americans were slaughtered, and she reduced 19 extremist hijackers. His voice dropped to a quiet register, and the sheer volume of that silence proved more devastating than any screaming crowd. As a native New Yorker who witnessed the tower's collapse, lost acquaintances, and deployed recovery teams, he stated he had never heard an American citizen minimize that tragedy until she took a microphone. Producing a photograph of Nicholas Hordos Jr. standing at the devastation site, wearing a shirt printed with her callous quote, "Trump humanized the collateral damage of her rhetoric." The man's mother was murdered in those towers. He wore Omar's apathy on his chest, and he demanded an apology that was never delivered. Sweeping his hand across the podium, Trump cataloged her history of geopolitical bigotry. He listed her accusations of dual loyalty, her claims that an allied nation had hypnotized the globe, and her rhetoric that ultimately resulted in Jewish students facing hostility on university campuses. Within 5 years, the legislative body voted 47 to 23 to condemn her rhetoric, meaning over 400 members of Congress, including her own political allies, had drawn a definitive line. His voice flattened into absolute disbelief as he summarized the ledger, $9 billion stolen from hungry youth, the worst terror attack minimized, allied citizens attacked, and yet she had the nerve to stand in the Congressional chamber and label him a lethal threat. He asked her, point blank, who truly represented the danger to the Republic. A staff member whispered frantically as Omar gripped her podium, her knuckles completely drained of blood under the intense lighting. She opened and closed her mouth repeatedly before accusing him of exploiting human tragedy for political gain. He countered instantly, clarifying that he was merely reading her own words and citing bipartisan committee reports if her established public record read like an exploitation of tragedy. That was entirely her burden to carry. Suddenly, the monitor on Omar's podium flickered on. Trump held a small remote presentation clicker, initiating a video feed that filled the screens. It displayed a hotel ballroom in Minneapolis on January 27, 2024, where Omar stood before her constituents, delivering an impassioned speech in her native tongue. The conservative translation, widely verified and deemed treasonous by figures like Elon Musk, scrolled across the bottom. She proclaimed her primary identity belonged to Somalia, promising to leverage the American systemic apparatus to protect foreign interests, and dictating that the United States government would obey their commands. After letting the footage play in agonizing silence for 30 seconds, Trump froze the frame on her raised hand. He repeated her promises slowly, emphasizing that she was pledging allegiance to a foreign power from inside the American legislative system. Pulling a final sheet of paper, he read the naturalization oath she took upon gaining citizenship, an oath demanding the absolute renunciation of foreign allegiances. The juxtaposition of her legal oath and her ballroom promises created an undeniable portrait of institutional betrayal. Her voice cracked as she frantically claimed the translation was an inaccurate, debunked right-wing fabrication. Trump remained unfazed, presenting a certified report from 3 independent, court-appointed native translators with 0 political affiliations, all of whom verified the substantive accuracy of the subtitles. Setting the verification aside, he offered a strategic concession, agreeing to use her office's sanitized translation regarding a naval agreement. He pointed out that even in her sterilized version, she admitted to utilizing her congressional authority to conduct foreign policy on behalf of Somalia, guaranteeing their coastal sovereignty. Stepping out from behind his podium to dominate the center stage, he framed both of them in the main camera shot. He recalled her dramatic exit during the State of the Union, revealing that he did not see a principled leader acting on moral outrage. Instead, he saw a compromised politician who realized the investigative walls regarding the $9 billion theft and the financial deceptions were closing in, leaving her with no more rooms left to escape into. He stated her televised screaming was born not of virtue, but of raw, unadulterated fear over what auditors were about to uncover. Unable to withstand the psychological pressure, Omar pushed her chair back. The metallic scrape against the studio floor cut through the microphone feed like a siren. She declared she would not stand there and endure accusations of betrayal from someone who incited an uprising. Trump's hand gestured downward in an absolute, unyielding motion, a gesture perfected over 14 seasons of firing executives on national television. He commanded her to remain, reminding her that she had her moment to scream and flee during his address. But now he held the floor, and he possessed the documentary evidence. Ignoring the moderator's plea that 4 minutes remained, Omar frantically gathered her notes while her staff mobilized off camera. Trump addressed her retreating back, noting that walking away was her signature maneuver. She walked away from his speech, she abandoned the fraud committee, and she fled every time investigators questioned her marital history, her missing $30 million, or her constitutional loyalty. As all 6 high-definition cameras tracked her exit, Trump delivered the ultimate parting blow, his voice easily reaching her as she pushed the stage door open. He warned her that while she could walk away from a television debate, federal investigations would not simply walk away with her. The door slammed shut, leaving the studio of 400 attendees and 47 million home viewers in breathless silence. Trump stood alone for 5 seconds, observing the empty podium, the scattered leather portfolio, and a dropped pen resting on the floor. Turning back to the camera, the theatrical persona was completely stripped away, leaving a raw, unrehearsed reality. He stated simply that she had slandered him as a fatal offender on a national broadcast. Yet when confronted with her own financial and ethical ledgers, she retreated into the shadows. Picking up the thin manila folder, he reiterated that he endures endless audits and answers every inquiry as the most investigated man in history. Yet his accuser could not survive a single unscripted town hall. He tapped the folder against the wood, declaring that while she could walk out of the room, the impending investigation certainly would not. Nodding once to the lens, he exited the stage. The footage of her flight went spectacularly viral before he even reached his motorcade, amassing 112 million views within 48 hours. The internet fixated not just on the exit, but on the frozen frame of his brother-in-law comment and the image of her abandoned portfolio resembling evidence left at a crime scene. Global trends mocked her retreat, and the phrase 9 billion morphed into a cultural shorthand for corrupt politicians utilizing racial grievances to deflect institutional accountability. Trump's observation about her walking away instantly became a ubiquitous meme applied to corporate disasters and sports failures alike. 36 hours later, Omar released a highly produced 2-minute and 40-second defensive video. She framed the debate as a coordinated spectacle designed to dehumanize a marginalized identity, leaning heavily into her refugee origin story and referencing his 34 felony convictions. However, the silence was deafening. She offered zero explanations for the E Street Group money funneling, ignored the $30 million valuation evaporation, bypassed the committee's fraud report, skipped the Somali ballroom translation entirely, and firmly refused to release her immigration paperwork. 2 minutes of curated victimhood yielded zero factual answers. The defensive mechanisms that had shielded her for 8 years completely shattered against the immovable weight of empirical data, proving that accounting ledgers are immune to narrative manipulation. The political ecosystem reacted with ruthless efficiency. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, when pressed by reporters, cryptically encouraged all members to practice total financial transparency, a statement acting as the Washington equivalent of kicking a liability out of a lifeboat while staring at the horizon. The Progressive Squad offered statements that were a mile wide but an inch deep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib posted vague social media support condemning the theatrical nature of the debate, but completely avoided defending the specific financial allegations. Cable news panels explicitly noted the strategic distancing, acknowledging that her allies were defending her demographic identity rather than her legislative record, a distinction with massive political implications. The institutional machinery rapidly accelerated. The House Oversight Committee expanded its scope, formally announcing subpoenas for the internal communications of Tim Mynette's enterprises and all affiliated holding companies. Simultaneously, the Ethics Committee launched a preliminary inquiry into the miraculous vanishing of the $30 million. Even the Justice Department investigation, initiated under the Biden administration in 2024, continued its forward momentum, with insiders leaking that the immense public pressure generated by the broadcast made any further bureaucratic delays politically toxic. Back in Minnesota, the structural damage to her coalition was fatal. Her approval ratings within the 5th District plummeted 11 points overnight, cratering by 19 points among senior voters. Capitalizing on the vulnerability, Amina Farah, a Somali-American certified public accountant with decades of community trust, launched a primary challenge that secured $3.8 million in grassroots funding within 2 weeks. Farah's launch video featured her standing before a local center holding an accounting ledger, explicitly stating she knew exactly what $700, $30 million, and $0 actually looked like, demanding a representative capable of basic arithmetic. Progressive media outlets, which had historically served as her Praetorian Guard, began the delicate process of amputation. Left-leaning podcasts devoted entire segments to the necessity of progressive financial accountability, and a prominent essay titled "Representation Without Accountability is Not Representation" went viral across the exact demographics Omar relied upon for survival. The financial vice tightened relentlessly as the Treasury Department placed Rose Lake Capital on a watch list after detecting offshore wire transfers from shell entities in Dubai and Mogadishu. Her partner's winery quietly dissolved in April, while legal watchdog groups filed formal complaints demanding comprehensive audits, publicly reminding the establishment that perjuring financial disclosures constitutes a severe federal crime. The lucrative speaking circuit that fueled her brand evaporated instantly. Universities canceled contracts, and political action committees quietly replaced her as their keynote attraction. In a modest Minneapolis apartment, Fatima Abdi, the very mother whose handwritten plea Trump had read to the nation, watched the political collapse unfold on her smartphone. Her young children sat nearby, drawing pictures and doing homework, completely unaware of the geopolitical forces shaping their reality. After viewing Omar's deflecting response video, which entirely ignored the $9 billion and the hungry children, Fatima simply closed the application. Sitting in the quiet hum of her kitchen, she opened a new tab, searched for Amina Farah's congressional campaign, and donated $25. Some betrayals transcend language entirely. What transpired on that stage was the brutal reality of what happens when hollow rhetoric collides with undeniable documentation. She arrived armed with manufactured outrage. He arrived armed with a folder of absolute truth. She fled the confrontation. He commanded the space, and the full weight of federal oversight followed her back to her district. The era of weaponizing identity to shield financial corruption suffered a mortal blow that evening under the studio lights. The active investigations are expanding. Subpoenas are being enforced. A formidable challenger is gaining momentum. And somewhere in a Washington office, a thin manila folder containing 30 pages of inescapable reality sits patiently waiting for the next hearing. She labeled him an architect of death. He exposed her as a financial illusionist, and only one of them actually possessed the receipts. Heaven help the veterans, the legal immigrants who respected the system, the defrauded taxpayers, and the hungry children, because the truth finally refused to walk away.